Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling something pretty fundamental, the whole philosophy of law.
Yeah, it really gets to the heart of how societies work, doesn't it?
Right.
We'll be digging into some fascinating, maybe sometimes uh, dense ideas.
Definitely. We're looking at law, its foundations, its connection to justice, mostly through Jacques Derrida, using Margaret Davies' work, Derrida and Law, as a guide.
And you've given us some really rich source material here. Makes you properly think about what's underpinning, well, everything legal.
Right. And look, it might sound like heavy philosophy, and, well, some of it is.
But the goal here is really to pull out the core insights, make them understandable, maybe even a bit surprising.
Absolutely. We're not here to just, list definitions. We want to explore the often paradoxical ways law claims its authority.
And how that connects, or sometimes clashes, with big ideas like legitimacy and justice. It's definitely more tangled than it first looks.
And Davies focuses on three key Derrida texts for this. Devant la loi,
Or before the law.
right, and the law of genre, and force of law.
And what's interesting, like right from the start, is how Derrida flags the naming itself. Before the law, it's as if the law had entitled itself.
Huh, yeah. Like, the law just declares itself the boss.
Exactly. This idea of self-entitlement, law setting itself up as the authority, that's a thread we'll definitely be pulling on.
Okay, so this idea, law just says, I'm in charge. Legal thinkers have been trying for ages to find a solid ground for it, haven't they?
Oh, absolutely. This quest for an absolute source of legitimacy, a kind of law of law.
Why, though? Is it just about wanting it not to feel random?
Pretty much. It's
Yeah.
driven by this desire to escape the feeling that law is just arbitrary, just someone powerful making rules. Davies mentions that.
But Derrida's work shows this search keeps hitting dead ends or paradoxes.
Exactly. Unresolvable contradictions and paradoxes, as Davies puts it. It's not that the philosophers failed, necessarily.
But more that these puzzles are fundamental, about meaning, authority, stuff like that.
That's a great way to look at it. The problems in legal philosophy kind of mirror bigger philosophical questions.
Now, we should probably clarify what we mean by law here. It's not just statutes and courts, is it?
Well, traditional philosophy often focuses there, yeah. But Derrida's thinking works on multiple levels. Social norms, even literary rules.
Okay. But for today, we're mostly sticking to the traditional legal theory side.
Primarily, yes. But keeping in mind that it's all interconnected, Derrida often starts, as Davies notes, with the positivist idea.
The idea that law is separate from, say, morality, non-law.
Right. But he's not mounting a direct attack on that. It's more like he's probing the edges.
Interrogating the conceptual frontiers, as Davies says. What do we even mean by law?
Exactly. It's about understanding the boundaries of the concept.
Okay. So that brings us to the modern era, the Enlightenment push for objective, rational laws.
Right. A big shift away from divine authority towards, well, towards things like practical reason.
Or even trying to ground it in physical laws, almost scientifically.
Yeah. And that's where legal positivism really digs in. This belief that law can be described objectively, it's grounded, and crucially, it's separate from politics.
And Kelson's pure theory of law is like the ultimate example of this.
It really is.
Yeah.
He tried so hard to strip away everything non-legal, morals, politics, society, to find the pure essence of law itself.
But that runs into trouble, doesn't it? You mentioned Wittgenstein.
Ah, yes. Wittgenstein's analogy of digging for reasons. It's perfect here.
How does that work again?
Well, imagine you keep asking why. For any rule, why follow this law? Because of that higher law, why follow that one? And so on.
You keep digging.
Exactly, until, as Wittgenstein says, your spade hits bedrock.
Yeah.
You can't give any more reasons. You just say, this is simply what I do.
So at the base of any system, there's just an assumption, something you can't justify further.
Precisely. And that's the problem Kelsen faced when he was searching for his basic norm.
Right. He pictured this hierarchy, fines authorized by acts by the Constitution. But what authorizes the first Constitution?
Exactly. What validates the historically first Constitution? That's the million-dollar question.
And his answer was the basic norm.
Yes. But here's the twist. Kelsen himself calls it a presupposition, a hypothesis, even a fiction.
A fiction? How can the foundation be a fiction?
Well, think about it. It can't be validated by a higher law because there isn't one. But it can't be invalid either because it's the source of validity.
Huh. So it's a paradox.
It is. Kelsen called it proper fiction. It contradicts reality because it's not a concrete law you can point to. It's just a conceptual necessity. It even contradicts itself. It grants authority without having authority in the same way.
So it's not like finding a stone tablet with the ultimate rule. It's more like an assumption we have to make.
Exactly. A conceptual condition, as Davies explains it, that lets us treat norms as legally binding, as objective. It's what allows the system to appear coherent.
So the solid ground isn't really solid. It's something we presuppose.
Yeah.
It's quite something. Law's authority rests on an assumption.
Pretty much. It's the condition needed to construct objectivity within the legal system. It lets us see law as more than just individual will.
And this isn't just Kelsen. Davies says others hit similar walls.
Right. Thinkers like H.L.A. Hart, even puzzles like parliamentary sovereignty. They reveal similar paradoxes when you push for that ultimate self-justification.
Which brings in Montaigne and Kafka. Derrida uses them to illustrate this.
Yes, exactly. Derrida quotes Montaigne talking about legitimate fictions that law uses to base its truth. Think back to Kelsen's basic norm fiction.
So law kind of relies on these accepted untruths almost.
Or at least unprovable assumptions, yeah, to establish its authority. And Kafka's before the law.
Ah, the man at the gate.
Perfect image, isn't it? Standing before the laws is absolutely emergent order, totally detached. Access to why the laws just deferred endlessly.
You're told not yet, and not yet becomes forever. The law recognizes you, but you don't get to question it.
Right. It promises transparency, but its own foundation stays hidden.
Which makes sense why critiques focusing on history or from indigenous, feminist, racial perspectives, why they're so important.
Because they pull back that curtain, right? They expose the ahistorical and acontextual pretenses, as Davies calls them. They show the politics baked into law's founding and continuation, despite its claims of neutrality.
So the search for this pure, self-justifying law of law keeps getting undermined by reality.
Exactly. And this leads Derrida to think about, well, literary genres.
Okay, the law of genre. Feels like a jump, but you said it's relevant. How does talking about, say, what makes a novel help us with law?
Well, Derrida says a genre, like a novel or poem, is defined by its limits. What makes it not something else? There's a law of demarcation.
Rules about what belongs inside the genre and what doesn't.
Right. Now think about legal positivism again. Its whole aim is to make law a distinct category, separate from non-law, like morality or politics. Raz's idea of the limits of law.
So law needs boundaries, just like a genre needs boundaries.
Precisely. But here's the really mind-bending part. Derrida's law of genre.
Okay.
He argues that the very rule or characteristic that defines the genre, or the law, it isn't itself part of that genre or law.
Wait, so the thing that makes law legal isn't itself a law?
Kind of. It's a prior condition, like Kelsen's basic norm. It's the limit, the boundary marker. Derrida says the remark of belonging does not belong. It belongs without belonging.
Okay, my head hurts a little. The rule defining the game isn't a move in the game.
That's a great analogy. It's absent, yet its trace is everywhere within the category. And this, Davies explains, leads to the law of impurity.
Impurity. So any attempt to make a pure category, like pure law,
is inherently contaminated by this other element, this defining principle that isn't strictly inside it.
So the boundary itself makes the infried impure, in a way.
Exactly. This law of impurity is fundamental. Without this impure law that decides what is purely law, you couldn't even have law as a concept.
It's this. Law of participation without membership, of contamination, as Davies quotes Derrida.
Right. It underlies any attempt to separate things, to impose form. Like oil and water, they separate, but there's always that boundary interaction.
So looking back at Kelsen, his cure theory is actually inherently impure because it relies on this basic norm, this external limit.
That's Derrida's point, yeah.
Yeah.
The otherness isn't just outside, it's woven into the law's structure.
And while positivists might talk about fuzzy edges or hard cases,
Derrida's saying this impurity isn't just at the margins, it's fundamental. And if law's authority relies on claiming purity and neutrality, but that claim rests on excluding this other, well, that's significant.
definitely something to highlight, not ignore. So the foundation is shaky, and the claim to purity is, well, impure.
Which has huge implications when we think about the force behind law.
Yeah.
That takes us to Derrida's force of law.
Okay, force and law. Seems obvious law uses force, right? Police, courts.
Yes, Derrida starts there. Law is always an authorized force. It's not just a suggestion, but the key question he asks is,
How is that legitimate force different from just plain violence? especially the violence that started the law.
Exactly. He talks about the original violence of the law, a violence not sanctioned by any prior law.
That sounds, yeah, unsettling, like a revolution or a coup.
That's a perfect example. A coup is illegal under the old system, but if it succeeds, its illegal act becomes the foundation of the new legality. That's the legitimate fiction again.
An illegal act becomes the source of legitimacy after the fact. Wow.
And Derrida suggests Kelson's basic norm is also a kind of violence, a conceptual violence,
Yeah.
because it forces us to interpret subjective acts as objectively legal.
So force isn't just backing up the law, it's actually creating the distinction between law and not law in the
Yeah.
first place.
Yeah, any theory that just accepts that distinction without questioning it is, in a way, participating in that enforcement.
Derrida calls the founding moment undecidable, right? Neither legal nor illegal.
Exactly. A coup de force,
Yeah.
an act that interprets itself as legitimate. That's what he means by the mystical foundation of authority. It's not rational justification, it's force establishing itself.
Like declaring yourself king. The power comes first, the justification after.
A good way to put it.
Hmm.
And crucially, this isn't just a historical event, a one-off founding moment.
It's iterable, repeatable.
Yes. Position is already iterability, Derrida says. Every single time a judge applies the law or an official enforces it.
They're reasserting that foundational authority, replaying that original moment.
In a sense, yes, they're continually reinforcing its basis. It's not just one paradox at the basic norm, like Kelson might suggest. Derrida sees this paradox of legitimacy repeating throughout the system.
I'm pointing this out isn't about, like, saying violence is good.
Not at all. It's about exposing law's lack of an absolute self-evident justification. It's about showing how claims of neutrality can mask this underlying force.
Like Drusilla Cornell said, recognizing the violence helps mitigate it.
Exactly. Understanding force's role lets us question those neutrality claims.
So this leads to law being undecidable, not simply founded or unfounded.
Right. Conditioned by that undecidable origin moment, and that undecidability echoes through every law.
Which links back to the law of impurity again.
Yes, law, like any system of limits, is set up by a law ensuring its own impurity, its paradoxical or aporetic nature.
And if it's built on interpretation and its foundation is unfounded, Derrida says law is essentially deconstructible.
Right. But again, deconstructible doesn't mean destroyable.
More like taking it apart to see how it works, understanding the assumptions.
Exactly. It's not about obliterating law. It's possible because law is textual, built on interpretations, and because it relies on distinctions like legal, inside-outside.
And deconstruction itself relies on that law of impurity to even be possible. It lets us question law's structure.
Okay, so if law is unstable, deconstructible, how do we judge it? How do we talk about justice? Positivism often just separates them, right?
Yeah, law is law, justice is something else, maybe morality. But Derrida sees a different relationship.
He calls law the element of calculation. It tries to set rules, apply them predictably.
But justice.
Justice, he says, is incalculable. You can't just capture it perfectly in rules.
So justice exists where the rules fall short, in the gaps.
Precisely, in the aporia of law. Law tries to calculate, but its deconstructibility means its foundations are always open to question. Justice's a venir are always still to come.
And he mentions 3 specific aporia, or gaps.
Yes. First, the uniqueness, the otherness of every single case. No general rule can ever fully capture every specific situation. Justice demands we somehow deal with that uniqueness, maybe even reinterpret the law for that case.
Okay, the uniqueness of the case. What's second?
Second is that undecidability of law's foundation we talked about. A truly just decision has to confront that instability, that lack of ultimate certainty.
And the third, aporia.
The need to actually make a decision. Justice might be infinite, always deferred, but law requires a finite ruling now. That decision is an interruption, a necessary cutoff, maybe even a kind of madness beyond pure logic.
Wow. Which leads him to say, deconstruction is justice.
Yes, justice isn't just following the rules, it's the response to law's limits. Recognizing the otherness it contains, the impossibility of total purity. Deconstruction reveals those limits, opening a path for justice.
So finally, the politics. Derrida's work connects law and politics in ways legal thinking often tries to erase.
Absolutely. Law often pretends to be neutral, equal.
Mm.
but that masks how it shapes power dynamics.
The inequalities critical theories point out aren't just flaws within the system.
They're inherent to the structure of law as a separate order, Derrida suggests. Unlike positivism, he doesn't ignore the force involved, that violent distinction between law and non-law.
So the ethical, the political, the social, they aren't outside law. They're tangled up right inside its structure.
Exactly. And justice isn't neatly inside or outside either. It's intertwined with law, but can't be reduced to law.
Okay, so summing up this deep dive, we've seen law claims authority, but rests on shaky ground, legitimate fictions.
It's inherently impure, relying on a foundational and ongoing force or violence it often hides.
Law is essentially deconstructible,
Yeah.
and justice isn't found just in the rules, but is this incalculable response to law's limits.
Right. So hopefully you can now see law less as this fixed, objective thing and more as this complex, contested field, shaped by history, paradoxes, constant interpretation.
So maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. How does knowing this challenge your assumptions about legal certainty, about justice in a specific case, or about how we critique or engage with legal systems?
Yeah. What does it mean to build our systems on a foundation that's, as Derrida puts it, by definition unfounded? Definitely food for thought.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.